Welcome to the first episode of Cross Section in 2026, where we discuss the global and domestic news headlines that have dominated the first 2 weeks of this year. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Well, hello and welcome. Cross Section is back for 2026. And what a first 2 weeks of the year it has been already. We are going to be looking at Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, everything. It feels like Grok and some local stories. Everything, everywhere, all at once is what it feels like. So, Danny and Alicia, you're joining me. Danny, Happy New Year to you. How are you feeling in 2026?
I'm loving 2026. It's a new year, but it is a busy one.
And Alicia, any exciting New Year's celebrations for your resolutions or anything to start 2026?
Not resolutions, but I was in Trinidad for Christmas and New Year, so I'm struggling to embrace the Arctic cold and chill that I'm experiencing here in London and soon to be in the north of England this weekend. So a slow start to 2026, no resolutions for me.
Well, a slow start for you it may have been, but not a slow start for the President of America and some other global actors. There are lots of big stories. We're going to start kind of looking at the global stage and all that's happening. And we're going to kick things off in Venezuela. Danny, why are we going straight to Venezuela in case anybody hasn't been watching just about all the news?
Well, I was very much still in Christmas holiday mode when this was happening. So for the first couple of days of this happening, I kind of saw the headlines and saw that US forces had captured the Venezuelan president, Maduro, on drug charges and had taken him off to the US. And it was one of those things I was kind of insisting on staying in my holiday mode. So I didn't really get into too much of the detail to begin with. I was like, this is an unusual step, was my initial reaction. But it's interesting. I came across this description of it as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was the American idea of foreign influence, initially in the Western Hemisphere, wanting Europe to stay out of American affairs, but post-Second World War, it was more about US influence all across the world. But this was the Monroe Doctrine, which is just do it almost, that they got it done, and then you kind of deal with the aftermath afterwards. If you spend ages talking about it, you may not actually ever get to do the things you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so why has he kidnapped, arrested, captured, I think was your more neutral word, Danny, because any other word loads something. Let's say from your perspective, why has he done this? You've said drugs, Danny. Is that the whole story?
I mean, I think the primary reason is because Trump can, and Trump sees an opportunity to exert his authority, his power, in many ways in response to, yes, it's about capturing, bringing them to trial, the president of Venezuela, but I think it's also to do with what is probably our joining conversation around trade and the relationship with the other kind of nations of Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, and really responding to that and to him seeing himself as kind of a dominant leader in that. I think my initial reaction was one of shock because I had literally just spent 2 weeks in Trinidad, which is in very close proximity to Venezuela. And my first piece was kind of like, how does this impact my family? In terms of Trinidad, in terms of its relationships with Venezuela, has a huge criminal gang, organized crime problem in terms of how things are coming through Venezuela, through Trinidad, and kind of causing all manner of chaos. So deeply concerned about that. I was equally aware of that there are many Venezuelans and even Trinidadians that think it was a good thing that Trump did. And this conversation about moral value, or how you assess, was it the right thing to do, even if there's no jurisdiction, even if there's no international agreement, not going to the United Nations, not even making NATO allies aware? And I think that's the challenge of this whole conversation is it possible to be moral and military, or have that exerting of power at the same time? Are they not two competing ideas? I mean, Kemi Badenoch spoke about it was morally right, for which some commentators says, what on earth does that even mean? Because if it's right for Venezuela, is this the new normal of how we're going to engage on the international stage?
And I think we'll probably say a bit more about the rightness or wrongness of the action, but this wasn't out of nowhere. The US regime, and Trump in particular, has historically been very hostile to the Venezuelan regime. In Trump's first term, he was indicted on drug charges, but they meant nothing because he was in Venezuela. So it's not a new hostility, but it is a new level of action in relation to it. And I think that's what everyone is trying to wrestle with, is like, okay, this level of unilateral activity of just doing something, and I don't like something, so I'm going to do something about it, rather than the usual international diplomacy, the discussion. It's just so different. And I think people are now scrambling to catch up, both practically with the consequences, but also kind of ethically and morally, to work out, well, what do we think about this? Are we back in an era where strong regimes use their power to do what they want to do? Or is there something that should constrain them in their actions? And even if an outcome is beneficial, so say you say, actually, it is better for Venezuela for his regime to have fallen, for him not to be the president, should there be something that stands in the way of other nations enforcing that action? So you can desire an outcome, but actually be very opposed to the process by which it happened. And I think that's my starting point around this one. And that I think we do need some level of regulation and restraint in international affairs that does govern how countries operate on the international stage.
Yeah, it seems to me his major issue legally might well be with Congress, and internally whether he had the right authority. He has abandoned to some extent the international rule of law, and even as you were saying, Danny, if removing Maduro could be defended due to the drugs, etc., the replacement is his deputy. He didn't bring in the Nobel Prize winning, the thing that he seems to want, the Nobel Prize winning opposition leader, who looks like she was democratically elected, but then was in rigged elections, didn't get it. So it's not like you can claim the moral high ground and say, we're putting in the person who was entitled to be there. He's ignored her and kept the deputy of the regime. So I think that's interesting. And I think there is a lot of, so any moral high ground in any other conversation, any pushback on somewhere like Ukraine is lost. I don't think there was moral high ground with this particular president, the way he's acted. So he is very clear, as you said, Danny, also that he wrote this in a strategy. Essentially, the Dunroe Doctrine in that strategic 30-page document put out a couple of months ago, more or less said they were going to do this, except nobody quite believed it was possible. And in the process, he's pushed back Russia and China and is very clear that there's a certain commercial aspect to this. There's protection of resources, and anything in their hemisphere, as they say, anything right beside them, they're going to deal with. And if you play ball like Panama appears to have done, then they aren't going to invade you. And if you don't play ball, or if they just need you, it moves us to our next story. They're just going to take over Greenland, because he said it again. Trump has doubled down this week on his threats to acquire Greenland, saying the US is going to do something there, whether they like it or not. If we don't do it, Russia or China will take over Greenland, and we're not going to have Russia or China as a neighbor. Somebody might need to point out where Alaska is, but that's a whole other conversation. So Greenland, who wants to kick off first then on Greenland and the 58,000 Greenlanders and their perspective in all of this?
Well, Greenland is an unusual territory in that it is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. It is governed more or less autonomously, but it is part of Denmark. So it is part of a European country. So I think the diplomatic stakes are much higher with Greenland. The idea, Denmark being a NATO country, if there was military action against another NATO country, this just baffles people's minds. Is it just being used to try and scare Denmark and Greenland into trade negotiations, into concessions? But it's also been said that the US have very, very significant use of Greenland for military purposes already. So what more do they want? Do they just want to be able to do it on their own terms without consulting Denmark? Is it just a leveraging tool? I kind of think it probably is. I can't imagine military action in Greenland, but then at the moment, I'm not sure what me not being able to imagine something actually means in this context.
I mean, I think it's the broader picture of Trump trying to exert himself as an international leader that plays by his own rules, and he has his own kind of who Trump's accountable to. What is clear in the first 2 weeks is it's not to the international order. he has very little regard in terms for European leaders, in terms of probably, the original agreement through NATO. He's thinking bigger picture, broader picture, and his kind of enemy in sight is those 4 or 5 autocratic nations: China, North Korea, Iran, Russia. And he'll do anything that benefits the American people, and most importantly, his leadership in responding to that. And Greenland is a part of the puzzle of that picture. Will there be military action? I have absolutely no idea. What I do know is that European leaders are not ready to we're seeing that kind of the tension, and you see it in the Prime Minister. How do you stand up for international order, rules base, which you would typically do if it was anyone else but the United States? The UK and Europe need the US on board generally for everything that's going on with Ukraine, and ultimately for their own nations in terms of trade agreements. And they don't have the military or economic power to really push back against the US. So there's a dependency in kind of their own domestic policy, but also into the international, and particularly in terms of Europe. So I'm not quite sure how this one plays out. And I think Trump is playing the ultimate Trump card at the moment, where he knows, I have a military base, I have economics, I have power, and he's confident in his leadership that no one's really going to undermine or threaten that at this moment of point.
That's it. So I absolutely agree. And I think chaos, he's maybe looking at Putin and seeing how chaos works to your favor and the ability to do the quick strike. He has a limited window. I think most commentators seem to be saying, due to US midterms and stuff, where he loses some of his clout. I think if you want an insight into what's going on in Greenland, the second best political drama of all time, in my view, is Borgen, after The West Wing, if you didn't know that was the best. And Borgen is set all around Danish politics, but the second season, I think it is all around Greenland. Chinese coming into Greenland and some of the implications of that. America's a little bit of a side player in that. This was all written a couple of years ago, but it's so interesting how it's playing out. And as you say, Danny, the US have 2 big bases there. They almost don't know what to do with it. They have free rein almost to do what they like there anyway. This seems to be a little bit of a move as to what's coming next. So we'll watch and see what happens in Greenland. The third big story that's evolving really right now, and even this morning, updates on this. So we're recording on Tuesday afternoon. This is to do with Iran. There have been protests for a couple of weeks now, but the scale of those has really ramped up. The level of death in response from the government forces has really increased. And this morning, Trump announced sanctions on anybody trading with Iran. I think it's tariffs of 25% if you're going to trade with Iran. So again, a lot of eyes on America, and certainly commentators I'm reading saying this does feel like a different move than some previous rounds of protests. The Ayatollah has his bags packed. People are saying this is much closer to regime change than has been the case previously. Who wants to come in first in Iran?
Well, I think one of the things is, like, are we at that toppling point? What we have witnessed over decades is that regimes look strong until they don't. Regimes look like they have authoritarian power to dominate and to rule, and then it collapses really quickly. So a regime can look strong. Yesterday, there were pro-Iranian state demonstrations in favor of the regime, and kind of as a sign of strength. But hundreds, I think 650 was the number I saw, people are estimated to have died trying to quell the protests. Information out of Iran is sketchy. The internet has been shut down. This again brings in the US regime and Elon Musk and Starlink technology being used to get information out. And the commercial aspect of it is interesting because so much of this is linked together. Using the tariffs regime, it affects other countries. It affects the US negotiations with China. How is that going to be impacted by their trade with Iran? And I think, just coming back to the Greenland story as well, one of the interesting things over the past couple of decades has been China's economic colonialism, using trade, using economic input into lots of different parts of the world to spread its influence. And I think Trump and the US government have looked and said, well, actually, we need to do more to use our economic muscle to express our influence and our rule and authority on the global stage. So I think trying to do this in relation to Iran are interesting. maybe I think it's not going to lead to the regime falling right now. But as I say, things can move very quickly.
I mean, a regime change in Iran, possibly to our ears, sounds palatable, desirable, but I think Syria is a template of actually, it's not a guarantee of bringing a level of cohesion back to a nation that has been led under such dictatorial rule for such a long time. My other reflection, not even geopolitical, is the challenge for the local church in Iran and in that region, where volatility, the instability, the civil unrest, and yet we learn and often read that within Iran it's the fastest growing church globally, or one of, and doing incredibly well in terms of kingdom thinking. And so my reflection is, the freedoms that I take for granted on a day-to-day basis here in the UK, where there are levels of civil unrest that is rising and escalating and has been for the last 2 years, we don't, though we have an imperfect government, but we don't have a government or a regime like Iran. How am I witnessing Christ? How am I sharing the gospel in this moment? How am I bridging the gap between people's economic state and vulnerability and desire for a different life with the opportunities and freedoms found in Christ in this time? And so there's a lot of intercession that needs to happen. I know Elam has organised a day of prayer tomorrow afternoon to kind of gather the global church around what's going on in Iran. Equally, within Venezuela, the Evangelical Council hosted or called the nation to a day of fasting and prayer for all that's going on there. And I think to our natural ear, that seems ineffectual, but we're not fighting flesh and blood. Everything that we're seeing is very much raging between kind of spiritual principalities behind the scenes. And I think the church needs to become alive and wise to that, and thinking, how do we respond with our spiritual armor rather than our political persuasions and diplomacy in the natural, as it were.
Yeah, I think we've obviously had an episode probably nearly a year ago with David from Elam when some of the moves were happening in Iran at that stage and commenting upon that. As you say, Alicia, one of the places that we're most alert to in terms of growth in the church. I think just at a global scale, I do think we're seeing some massive shifts. A lot of this probably ties into Iran and China. Some of the questions are, if America's saying we're controlling our world, our hemisphere, does that mean Russia can do what it likes in Ukraine? Does that mean China can do what it likes in Taiwan? When you look at the stories of Syria, Iran, Venezuela, like a lot of these do tie into those world powers looking for resources and key oil primarily, and their global influence. And there's a pretty brutal commercial aspect to some of this where they're going after those things and doing it. But for me, I think the big question underlying that isn't international law and the international rule of law dead or dying. I mean, Nuremberg is a movie that's out recently during the summer, passed through Nuremberg and went to the courtroom where those original trials were. And that's where that was created, in a sense, and largely based on Judeo-Christian principles. The idea that even though we didn't have a written law, it was clear there were basic fundamental rules that we could all subscribe to. And on that basis, we were prepared to convict people for the murder of people in concentration camps. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon as we look kind of at global history, that idea. But that's all we've ever known. And it seems perfectly natural to us. And it is undoubtedly being at least pushed at, even if maybe not torn up just yet. And I think the challenge of that, there's a guy called John Bew, who has been foreign policy advisor to a number of prime ministers. We'll tag a link to a couple of articles he's written, slightly biased because he's from Northern Ireland, but really interesting perspectives. Are we on another shift at a global level, or even, at a political level? He talks about this fourth era. But one of the things that interests me in that is, he talked about Pitt and Castlereagh and the government forming and different times of government. He's like, what if you put 20 or 30 people together and try to redesign what's coming in the future? He said he doesn't know what's coming, but it feels like we're in a shift both locally, just the rise of reform and some of the changes in UK politics, and then globally. And he said that might not, it's happening. Whether it's good or bad, we'll only know afterwards. But it ties in with some of the things Mark Sayer's been saying. We're in the grey zone, we're in another big shift again. It's very unclear what's coming next and what's going to be agreed. We have grown up in an era where peace was normal. No two countries with McDonald's ever went to war. Things like that seem perfectly normal. And now we're seeing significant shifts around that. So absolutely, we need to be praying into that, praying particularly for the countries involved. But also there is a space for new ideas and new thinking in what is coming forward. With that, we're going to move from the global scale, the big picture, the macro. You are listening to Cross Section as our first episode of 2026. Like, review, share, do feedback. You can email us at cross.section@eauk.org. After 4 years or something, I might have finally got that right. Hopefully that's correct. You can follow Danny and myself on social media. You'll find us there. Alicia is far too sensible to do that. We are going to turn then to a couple of UK stories. And the big one that's really probably in terms of the headlines this week is around Grok. Grok being the AI that's built within the Twitter platform or X platform. And it is in the news because people have been using it or commanding it or doing whatever to basically create either people in bikinis or nude images of people. You put it in and tell it to undress them, and then sharing these images. And there is big pushback from Ofcom and from the Women and Equalities Committee. Danny, I mean, no, it was going to come to Alicia, but Danny, you apparently have actually tried with ChatGPT and Grok. Maybe not the full service, should we say, but you've been experimenting to see what you can or cannot be done.
Yes, I was restrained in the prompts I provided. I was having not really used any of these services for image editing. I asked both ChatGPT and Grok to put me in swimming shorts, and it did that at the single command. Now, in some ways, photo editing software is not new. The ease with which it's used, I think, is part of the issue. The tie-in with social media is obviously problematic. The images are shared. There is the level of consent that's involved, that actually people can take an image of anyone and do what they like to it. So I think that it is somewhat different. Like, Photoshop's existed for a long time. People can Photoshop an image if they want. But you can also use the tools to create videos, which I saw a lot of people experimenting with that you can get people to do things like in some ways, the likeness isn't amazing. It alters the images quite quickly, but that almost doesn't matter because it's not, people will quite often know that an image might not be real, but it's still highly problematic that these images or these short videos are being created. The question then is, what do you do? There's talk about, is Grok going to be banned? Is X going to be banned? The UK and Canada and Australia talking together about what collective action they might bring. X being very close to the US regime with Elon Musk. How much will it offend the US and free speech champions over there? What could be a narrow internet regulatory question also then becomes a geopolitical question again.
I think from both the two stories or the two segments that we're exploring so far, I think my main thinking is how powerless a nation state is in both international affairs. There's a dependency, there's a requirement for partnership and collaboration. And if one nation decides to pull out of that rules-based order, well, the nation state becomes deeply vulnerable. But then equally, the role of technology. How can a government or a nation kind of create a system that is both domestic but responds to the international reality, that tech moves at a pace that is far-reaching, is accessible. We, the consumers, love it. I was thinking seeing this morning on BBC London Breakfast, a story of a young guy doing vox pop videos on the street, which is very popular. I see Being Human doing something similar, but not of this kind, where he's using smart glasses and he's recording young women in that who are completely unaware of that. He posts online, and then that image and that video content is being used and repurposes for sexually explicit content. I mean, what's the nation state? How does that respond to that? Is it going to tell tech companies, we don't want your technology here, we're going to put increased tax upon you? Well, that affects the national economy. So there's something about the nation that is deeply powerless to the modern problems that we are facing. I see the Women and Equalities Committee have decided to come off X. And as you mentioned, other nations are really riling against X. I think that's in part because it's owned by Elon Musk. If I'm being really direct about that, I think it's about a real resentment and animosity to him. And insofar as he's the owner of X, and therefore it's easier to come off on that. I think the wider government are thinking around that. I think there's a level of hypocrisy, for being honest. There has been sexually explicit content that has been monetized for generations and decades, for which nation states have never responded to, or OnlyFans or Pornhub or the issue of pornography. There is a lot they could do to outright ban it, and they've never come out with that same kind of vitriol, that same passion and upset. So in many ways, I look upon this and think politicians have a double standard on the issue of explicit content.
I'm not seeking to defend this, but
Great.
is this the threshold around consent, the challenge around AI and its usage that's been so high in the news just the last week or so, is this idea that, as you say, someone could film someone on the street and then create sexualized images of someone, or even just take a photo of someone and put them in a bikini and post that online, is the issue of consent. And now that this is one of the points that's often talked about, in that kind of consent is like the final threshold, or the only thing that our Western society has in terms of sexual ethics. Is that the problem that this is hitting against, which is why this is becoming an issue where pornography more generally isn't?
Probably, but I also think that the principle of consent is in itself a flawed fallback that the West has embraced, that if we give consent, that means it's right. It's morally right because consent has been explicitly given, which is a very grey area around sexual content. So I think that needs to be challenged, and I think we, as the church, need to continue to challenge that theology, that ideology. Peter, sorry, for coming in.
No, it's fascinating. I think consent is really interesting. Again, largely Christian idea, early church idea, and Tom Holland very good on this. That the idea of consent, even within sexual relationships, was a broadly Christian idea. But then I think it steps back to image, so that we have underestimated the importance of image in our culture, and as image bearers, we need to get better at stressing that. So the whole capturing of image, the importance of our image, what is the value of our image? So people are taking images of each other. And you were always able to do, as you said, Danny, at some level, you could take a picture and put bits together, and you could do that just very manually. Then it became Photoshop. Now this can be done online and with AI. But I think it starts to beg this question: what is illegal in what has been done? And we're going after Grok because it's the easiest, because you've said ChatGPT, Anthropic, Claude. I'm not saying they can all do it, and I don't know where all the boundaries are, but what is immoral in that, and what is illegal in that, and why do we have a problem? If somebody did that with the consent of the other person, is that okay? Is it the sharing is largely illegal if it's a nude image because it's a Telecommunications Act? There's law already around that, and I think it's beginning to open our eyes to something we and others have been talking about, AI and sexuality, where that goes. It's inevitable it's going to be used to push the boundaries of that. It's inevitable it's going to be used to do the fake news stuff. So we see it already. You get the more humorous videos of something like President Trump and other people, and you can see their AI, but as that gets better and better and better, forget revenge porn and the offenses against that. You won't need to do it. You can create your own version of it and create your own version of everything under the sun, as we've said. And so where will we get the trust of our sources in that? And I looked at those glasses and was chatting with my own kids about the Meta glasses, and just like, they've got a collab, I think it's Ray-Ban. It's almost impossible. And I saw a video of somebody recently. I said, look, they're wearing those glasses. I was saying to kids, I'm sure those have got the tiny little lens in them, but it's almost impossible to see. It changes every meeting, every engagement. If somebody potentially has those on, is able to record in a public space, you don't need consent. So we're going to have to look at all our rules. One of the most interesting things for me going forward is my 16-year-old is interested in studying potentially law. Most people go, lawyers are done. AI is going to replace everything. I think firms will have an ethicist going forward in the same way we have somebody involved in HR. 20 years ago, most companies had a tiny HR department, if anything, outsourced it. Now the HR person is generally sitting at the top table. I think in 20 years, we're going to have an ethicist. It doesn't have to be a lawyer, but somebody's because it will say, AI can do anything. Our company can do almost anything. Should it? Is it right to? What are the implications of it? And we're going to have way more of those conversations. That's a really interesting place to talk, because we have a moral framework to discuss that as Christians. I think many in our culture don't, but then go, I don't like that. I was okay with all this. I was okay with porn, as we've said. I was okay with all these other things. But I don't like this Grok being able to undress me and send an image around. Why? Why have we drawn a line there? And I think this is where it gets into really interesting moral value conversations, where our framing story as Christians helps us engage well, because image is so critically important to who we are. So anyway, there's my thoughts on that. I think, Alicia, you want to come back in?
No, I'm good.
You're just fixing your mic then.
Yes.
Okay, so again, I mean, there's a little bit of a free speech theme even in that with some of the stories we've had before, but I mean, it raises fantastic, interesting questions, I think, that we'll almost certainly return to. And then just lastly, there were a couple of cultural stories that caught our eye as we wrap things up here. The very, I think, really sad story around Philip Yancey, the Lily Phillips baptism. Lily Phillips, I think, is the correct name for Bonnie Blue, which ties us to the previous story.
No, you're confusing.
I've got
your
the
own
wrong
fans,
guy. Do we not have? Yes, I
good.
do. But I thought somebody sent me that as well. Anyway, right. Lily Phillips. Who is Lily Phillips? Remind me again.
Lily Phillips,
same world.
Blue, the same world, but different people.
Different numbers.
Okay. Yes. And then, well, let's do. Who wants to come in on either of those two stories first?
I'm going to take Philip Yancey.
Okay.
So the news around Philip Yancey, author of What's So Amazing About Grace, probably one of the best-selling Christian authors of the last few decades. It was announced last week that he was stepping back from all forms of ministry after an 8-year extramarital affair. He is in his 70s. He has, I believe, Parkinson's. His wife is his primary support. She also issued a statement expressing her hurt, but also saying that she would stay with him. But the deep breach of trust that this represented, one of the details that one of the questions I immediately had was, well, was this a historic situation or was it 8 years to now? I don't know the answer to that. I think it does pose the question of how do we deal with people we respect, people we look up to. A lot of people would look at authors and speakers as kind of mentors in the faith, and that this person has inspired me and encouraged me and helped me grow in my faith. And what do we do when people like this fall and sin in such very obvious ways? But it's also not new. I think in the last few years, 10 years, we've heard story after story after story of leaders who have, often it's sexual sin. It's not always, but often it is. And that is difficult to reckon with. It is something that's really hard to reckon with. How do you say, actually, this person has helped me in my understanding about grace or the development of my faith, and yet this person has also obviously lived a life that is a lie and has sinned in such a way. But I think we can also, it also encourages us not to lean too heavily on public figures, however good their books are, however excellent their preaching might be, that our faith is not dependent on them. And I think that's something that these kind of stories can help us to remind us of that.
Yeah. Just following on from that, in terms of Philip Yancey, the sense of the learning for all of us is to be mindful that however seasoned, however long in faith, however well-versed you are in the scriptures, that we are all susceptible to sin and we're all susceptible to making error of judgment. And there's an importance of kind of guarding our lives and being accountable for things in its early stage rather than feeding on that. I think similarly, for potentially some of our younger viewers, they definitely will know who Lily Phillips is, and it lends itself to the previous story in terms of the wider conversation around consent. She is a viral content producer. She's on OnlyFans. She has been in many ways, I would put, selling her body, her image, her beauty for sexual gain, and has boasted in that and made a monetary living off of the back of that. She's a young woman. She's 24 years old. However, over the Christmas period, there was a video on social media showing her to having a baptism and being baptized, and speaking about how she has come to faith. Now, my first comment is, anyone, I believe in radical conversions. It is littered throughout scripture of people who have gone from darkness to light, and it's possible, whatever their previous life, we are made new in Jesus. I think the part that people are commenting on, whether Christian or not, is this genuine? is this a genuine conversion, or is this her seeing kind of what has taken place over the last 12 months of a rise of spirituality, a rise of Christian kind of thinking and thought, and a resurgence amongst a younger generation, and her leaning into that space in order to maintain the commercial image of Lily Phillips? Who knows? But I will be continuing to pray for her and pray that her faith and salvation is mature in the Lord, and that she will renounce the old life, the OnlyFans, as that is most definitely a fruit of encountering the living God. So who knows? We shall see.
Thank you for your input there, guys. Yeah, I totally on the Yancey one. I just think we've got to, our faith is never in these writers, but they are often a mediating presence within our faith. And these are moments of reminder. I think the one tiny thing that I thought was positive, he absolutely owned it and didn't try and justify it. And that's an incredibly low bar. But I have seen so many others say, oh, but I'm now in love with this other person, I'm going to move on, or almost try and justify their newfound status. So at least there was proper, it feels like contrition and a full stepping back. Somebody did observe, it was his ministry made the statement, no mention of a church that he was connected with. And it is one of those things when you're on the move, traveling, a profile speaker, coming under the authority of a local church, I think incredibly important thing to do. And on the Lily Phillips, now that I've worked out which one it was and not Bonnie Blue, I do think there's a really interesting episode on a podcast called Modern Wisdom. I think I might have mentioned it before, with Louise Perry and Bonnie Blue. Now it's dark. It is dark on this. But Louise Perry came to faith through this. She wasn't involved, in that kind of OnlyFans, but in her feminism drove her to that and asked these real questions about the consent thing that we were talking about before. Essentially, is consent enough? How do we move beyond that? Is that not the lowest possible bar? Because everything Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue and people like that were doing was they were saying they've consented, therefore it's legal and it's okay. And yet as a culture, we were kind of almost going, and this wasn't just a Christian culture, beyond, we're going, oh, this feels too far, too much. But there's no basis to say it's a problem, because we left consent as the only bar almost ethically or morally left. And so these stories are fascinating to see somebody like Lily Phillips get baptized, seem to come to faith. I think it's also a broadening of that movement that had been a little bit maybe more dominant within young men. And we're seeing more stories around young women. So Louise Perry included in that. And the other story we were going to pick up just at the end, Bible sales soaring and continuing to rise here in the UK, because in the midst of all the chaos globally, in the midst of some of these really challenging stories, we are continuing to hear around the quiet revival at the local level of people just turning up at church. Again, lots of people saying Christmas was incredibly busy in churches, people coming along, people out there buying Bibles, stories of people coming to faith. Hopefully they are genuine. If not, the fact that people think that that's a thing to be talking about and that's now okay is a cultural shift. It has become acceptable to talk about your Christian faith. There's a more open season. So our biggest encouragement, I think, as we wrap up to you is now is the time absolutely to be talking about this. And it has changed out there and people are more open. And in part, that is because of the chaos that is going on around us. And people are looking for answers in something that is beyond. There is no hope in politics at this moment. There's no hope in economics. And people are saying, where am I going to place my hope? And so our encouragement to you is, even as you wrestle with these global news stories, in fact, potentially exactly as you do, these are moments to shift the conversation and say, where are the ethical lines? Where are your boundaries? Why does that story not feel right to you? Why are you struggling with it? And how might we turn these conversations into really interesting encounter points? Hopefully that's helpful as our first episode of 2026. We will, of course, be back next week discussing more of the stories. Who knows what will be on next week's agenda? Who knows what countries will have been invaded by then? With that, we will leave you. Be blessed.